There's a moment that comes in certain relationships that's hard to describe until you've been there. It's not a fight. It's not a dramatic ending. It's quieter than that. It's the moment you realize, really realize, that explaining yourself again isn't going to change anything. Not because you haven't been clear enough. Not because you haven't tried hard enough. But because the person across from you isn't available to hear it in the way you need to be heard. And something in you finally knows that. This is one of the most significant and underrated moments in personal growth. Not because it's comfortable, it isn't. It can feel like grief, like failure, like giving up on something you wanted to work. But it isn't giving up, it's clarity. And clarity, when it arrives, changes something permanently. The first thing worth understanding is why we explain ourselves in the first place. It's not weakness, it's not codependency necessarily. It comes from something very human. The belief that if you can just find the right words, the right framing, the right moment, they'll understand. And if they understand, things will change. For a lot of people, this belief has deep roots. Maybe you grew up in a home where your feelings weren't taken seriously unless you could justify them precisely. Where love was conditional on being understood correctly. Where conflict only resolved when you could explain yourself well enough to satisfy someone else. And so you got very good at explaining. You learned to articulate your experience with nuance and care. You learned to anticipate objections. You learned to soften your needs so they'd be easier to receive. All of that made sense in the environment it developed in. The problem is that you're still doing it in relationships that have the same structure, where no amount of explaining ever quite lands, where you finish speaking and feel more unseen than when you started. The second thing is what keeps people in the explaining loop long after it stopped working. Hope, partly. The next conversation might be different. Maybe they're having a hard day. Maybe if you approach it differently. But underneath the hope is something older. The belief that being understood is something you have to earn. That if you haven't been heard, it's because you haven't explained well enough yet. That the failure is in your delivery, not in the other person's capacity to receive. This keeps people trying long past the point where trying makes sense. Not because they're naive, because they've internalized that their worth is tied to being understood. And to stop explaining feels like accepting that they don't matter, which isn't true, but it feels that way. The third thing is what's on the other side of that moment. When you stop explaining yourself to someone who won't hear it, not in anger, not in defeat, but from a place of genuine clarity, something shifts. Not immediately in the relationship, but in you. You stop organizing yourself around their understanding. You stop editing your experience to make it more palatable. You stop trying to earn what should have been offered freely. And in that space, the space that opens up when you're no longer spending yourself on someone who can't receive it, there's room for something else. Room for relationships where you don't have to explain yourself quite so carefully. Where being heard isn't a negotiation. Where your experience is taken seriously without you having to justify it first. That's not a small thing. That's a different way of moving through the world. And it starts with one moment. The moment you realize that the explaining was never the problem. If you're in that place, if you can feel the exhaustion of being the one who always has to make yourself understood, I'd love to have a conversation with you. I offer free 30-minute clarity calls for people who are ready to look at this honestly and figure out what the next step is. The link is in the description. Deeper understanding, real change.